Okay, hello all you crazy people out there. My name is Michael. I like wizards and dragons and making games. Let's talk about data structures. So there is one little tiny annoyance that you may have noticed when it comes to arrays in GameMaker. You might have run into this problem once or twice over the years. And this has to do with the behavior that occurs when you try to pass an array by reference. So let's start with something familiar. Let's create a DS list. I'm going to call this list equals DS list create. Let's add a few values to this list. DS list add list, and the values that we can add maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then if I were to define a function that says something like function do stuff to a list, and it takes a list as a parameter, let's call it input list, and this function is not really going to do anything interesting. It's just going to ds list, let's say ds list set an index in the input list. Let's change index, let's change index 1 in the list to contain a value of 100. So before we run this code, we can check to see what the contents of this DS list are. We can just create a little for loop for var I equals 0, I is less than 5, I plus plus, and we can show debug message. We can say ds list find value. You can also use the list accessor if you wish, and the list that we're going to check is going to be list. The index that we're going to be checking is going to be I. That's going to print out the values inside this list in order. Let me just print a little separator here. And then we can run our function do stuff to a list with an O there. We can call this function on the list that we created, and then we can just run this again. And when we do this the second time, we would expect to see that the values in position 1 in this list has changed from 2 to 100. So if I were to run the game, we will see that this is exactly what happens. If I were to open up the console and scroll up a little bit, first we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then we have 1, 100, 3, 4, 5. That's exactly what we told the computer to do. And you might expect this to work similarly for arrays. So arrays in GameMaker are a lot like DS lists. They have very similar behaviors. They have very similar things that you can do with them. And you can generally substitute one for the other in most situations. There are a few minor differences in behavior, but overall, Yo-Yo Games is working to converge the functionality of arrays towards lists. Anyway, given these 19 lines of code here, you would expect it to work pretty much exactly the same way with regular arrays in GameMaker. So let's convert all this to a regular array. Let me convert this to an array literal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 instead of a ds list create. I'm going to say do stuff to an array is going to be this function name now. Input array. It doesn't really matter what we call this. This is just, I'm just calling it this because I don't want to have misleading names in my code. And show debug message, instead of using ds list find value, we can say look up array index I. Much more simply. Also, let's change the name of the array to array instead of list, and let us change the name. Let us actually call this function on the correct variable when we say do stuff to array. And now instead of saying ds list set, we can say input array index 1 is going to equal 100. And given everything we know about arrays, this should do exactly the same thing when it comes to this code as it did with the list. And if we were to dismiss that and look in the console down here, we will see that this is actually not the case. What we have instead is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the first printout, and then we call the do stuff to an array function, and then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 the second time. And that should not be the case. Let me call game end at the bottom of this code so I don't have to close the window myself. If you were to, for example, try to do a little bit of primitive debugging in this inside this function on your own, you could show message input array index 1 before you make this change, and then you could, after you make the change, you could do it again. And if you were to do this, you would see most mysteriously that the first time the message box pops up, you have a 2, and then the second time the message box pops up, you have 100. But down here in the console, indeed, instead of having a 100 in index 1 in the array, you still have a 2. And if you don't know what's going on, you can honestly spend a lot of time pulling your hair out over this. Let me just get rid of this. So what's happening is that arrays in GameMaker, if you just pass them to a function as a parameter, you will pass a reference to the array, you will pass a reference to the original array. However, if you try to change the values inside the array after that, inside the function, you will actually create a new copy of the array. So as soon as you run this line of code here, line 5, as soon as you run this line of code, you now have a new copy of input array that is completely separate from the one that you passed in as a parameter. And as soon as you try to make this change, the original array is untouched. And if you pass in the array by reference to this function and you expect its contents to be changed inside this function and those changes to be reflected once you leave that function, you will find that that is not the case. And that's actually really annoying. That's something that GameMaker does with arrays that I can't honestly say I know of any other languages, any other programming languages that do this. It's really annoying. And what you would do, there's a few ways you can get around with this. The one that you really should do, because this will generally lead to the fewest complications, is use what is known as the array accessor. So some of the other data structures in GameMaker have accessors. If you're using a DS list, you can access an index in the array using the pipe symbol as the accessor inside square brackets. And that will tell GameMaker that you should treat this value as a DS list. Grids, likewise, you can use the pound sign, and you could use indices inside the square brackets followed by the pound sign to easily access a position in a grid without having to use the dsGridGet function. Maps also have an accessor, the question mark. Structs have an accessor, that's the dollar sign. You generally don't need any special accessor for an array, but in the particular case of this copy on write behavior that arrays exhibit when passed to functions as arguments, you may want to use the @ symbol. And now when you run the game, you will find that the second time that we print out these values, we do indeed have a 100 being printed out in index 1 in this array. And the array accessor simply indicates that you should modify the original array when it's passed to a function as a parameter, rather than creating a new copy, which, once again, is really honestly how arrays should work in GameMaker to begin with. And it's really kind of annoying that they don't, and it can cause problems if you're not aware of this behavior. And in the worst of cases, it can lead to some bugs that are rather difficult to isolate and rather difficult to do anything about if you don't know what's going on. So that's the array accessor. If you're to try to use the array accessor in something like when you are looking up a value in an array like this, when you're not actually writing a value to it, when you're simply reading a value to it, nothing will happen at all. It won't be good, it won't be bad, it just really won't do anything. There are some people who use GameMaker who just prefer to do this with all of their arrays, just regardless of what they're doing, just as a habit. And that is completely valid. It won't break your code or anything. If you just want to be in the habit of using the array accessor all the time, feel free to just use the @ symbol anytime you use a value in an array. You can see when I run this code again, it works exactly the same way as it did before. By the way, does this symbol have a name? I always just call it the @ symbol. It really is just called that. It doesn't have a fancy name like the pound sign or the caret or the like asterisk or anything like that. Commercial @. Officially, the symbol is called commercial @. There are numerous nicknames for it, including snail curl, strudel, whirl, and whirlpool. Whoever named this sucks. Okay, you have no imagination. Russell K, GameMaker's chief technology official, I think that's his title within the Yo-Yo Games company. He has actually gone on record saying that he is not a fan of this, and I believe he's mentioned a couple times in the Discord that if he were to rewrite GameMaker Studio over again from scratch, he would not include this behavior. He would just allow us to pass arrays to a function by reference like any other normal programming language would allow. I'm not 100% sure what the original rationale behind this, if you want to call it a feature, it was in the first place back in the early days of GameMaker Studio 1. I suspect it was to prevent people from accidentally changing the contents of an array that they pass to a function by accident, but I think in practice what happens much more often than that is that people try to do it on purpose and then it doesn't happen because you need to use the array accessor and arrays are copy on write. And I think overall this has caused a lot more headache to GameMaker users than benefit. I hope someday that Yo-Yo Games decides to make this video completely obsolete and decides to just make arrays pass by reference, full stop, no questions asked, like any other programming language, but alas, that is not the case. Anyway, I'm going to stop now. This is just a short video explaining the array accessor. This is probably the last video that I'm going to make on data structures. There's nothing else that I really want to say. At least not unless Yo-Yo Games decides to add, remove, or change some functionality regarding them. There's one other thing regarding the array push function that Russell has also mentioned, maybe coming to GameMaker at some point in the distant future, that I really, really wish would just get here, because to make a long story short, the array push function could perform better, but that's maybe a story for another day. Anyway, that's it. I will not be sharing the code for this one because it's literally just a couple of lines. However, I do try to post about 2 game dev videos a week, one tutorial, and one Let's Make a Tower Defense game. I have a Patreon, so if you want to contribute towards these videos being made, there are links to that in all the usual places. Otherwise, this is just one of those weird GameMaker quirks. A lot of you seem to like these videos on weirdly specific topics in GameMaker, so there you go. My name is Michael, and I will see you all later. Special thanks to Connor, Edward Holt, Emily Koyo, Posho, Sindra Larson, Tusk, and Zenjamin for supporting these videos. If you want to see your name in the credits or hear yourself shouted out at the end, head on over to the Patreon page down in the video description to join the fun.